Unmanned systems in modern warfare. I'm Andy. I'm an engineer by trade with approximately 20 years of experience in the world of technology to my name. Once upon a time ago, I used to run the research and development department for a company that develops drones for the armed forces and emergency services. I also have about 15 years of military experience to my name, both as a full-time serviceman and as a reservist, which includes about 5 years as a reservist in military intelligence. So as you can see, I kind of have that double whammy of professional interest to dig deeply into how unmanned systems are impacting modern warfare. So I have that little bit of an insider's view. My intent today is to share with you some of what I learned about how radically warfare has changed because of these unmanned systems. I need to warn you, I do have some footage. Some of it is graphic, but I make no apologies for that because you do need to see the gravity of what we're talking about. So let's get into it. So, interest and need. We are in a new era of war that none of us are used to. The rules have changed. Without the right understanding, you're going to make wrong decisions, and the result is you'll die. Or even worse, you'll get soldiers underneath you killed. So I'm going to break this apart into three main sections. I'm going to look at the technology, the threat, and then the response. The technology. Deep recce and long-range strike has become by far the primary method of the two sides killing each other on the battlefield. So we're going to look at these in the two components and then recombine them. So the deep recce and the long-range strike. Recce and the transparent battlefield. So back in the old days, ISR systems were these prestige-level capital assets. So they were in short supply, they were very expensive, and it was competitive between units to get access to these systems to deploy out on the battlefield. So it meant you had to pick your targets based on predictions of where you think the enemy is likely to be or is likely to be in the future. So as a result, the vast majority of the battleground was actually blind to you, apart from these small patches where you had deployed your assets to monitor the battlefield. So what that means for your enemy is if they are a small unit using some sneaky tactics on the battlefield, the probability of being detected is almost zero if they successfully move through those blind areas. And that was actually part of the TTPs they used to keep themselves safe, was by being that tiny little speck in a huge ocean where it's very difficult to just by sheer probability spotting them whilst they move. That's now changed. ISR drones are the easiest and simplest to understand, but they are the backbone of why unmanned systems have become so dangerous in modern warfare. In the new ways, what you're seeing on screen, these are not capital asset ISR kit, not by a long shot. What's happened is they've become more like commercially available systems, leaning into the world of consumer electronics. It allows them to take advantage of economies of scale, making them affordable and abundant by exploiting modern mass production techniques. So for you on the battleground, that means you don't need to be targeted anymore. You get a whole load of this equipment and you send it out en masse into the battlefield and monitor every square inch. So the battlefield has now become transparent, where the probability of being spotted is now almost 100%. Whatever you're up to, chances are the enemy has seen it. So the days of stealth and covert action are almost gone. Even thousands of kilometers from the front line, odds are you've been detected. And with the altitude and range that some of this equipment can operate, you can't even presume you'd be aware that you've been compromised. And they've become so prolific that quite often, in a lot of areas, reconnaissance by ground forces has become almost obsolete. One of their big unique selling points is that they have a negligible burden on the operators in terms of weight and operational infrastructure. So these things can be distributed down further to smaller formations. So these small formations of military forces are ending up with an organic ISR capability beyond anything they've ever been used to. As an example, the one in the top left, that's a DJI Mini. That's the kind of thing you could put multiples of those into a soldier's day sack. And the one in the bottom right is the Techaver AR3. This is the sort of thing you could put a small crew and one of these in the back of a Hilux and just send them out to go do their work. And with that system, they could reach out to about 300 kilometers, even further if they have no intention of that system coming back, which is a very common tactic for this equipment to be preemptively chosen to be sacrificed to the cause of the mission. even when they are expected to come back and be reusable, it's not uncommon for them to only make it as far as 5 or 6 missions before they're lost and need replacing anyway. So now it's more like this. EO, electro-optical, IR, infrared, RF, radio frequency. All three of those are a form of electromagnetic radiation. All that means to you is all three of them are a form of light. The EO, the electro-optical, visible light, we understand that because we can see it. We understand camouflage and concealment. We understand about the dangers of shining a torch in the middle of the night. We get it because it's familiar to us. The problem for us is infrared and RF, we can't see it, but the machines can. So if you go into an abandoned building that's supposed to be cold and you warm it up to make it habitable, that is effectively the same as switching on all the lights in the middle of the night, and the machines will see it. If you have a VHF radio antenna and you put that up and you turn it up to full power, you are creating a giant ball of light with a 20-kilometer radius that the machines can see. Your thermal and RF signature is what's going to get you detected. So although IR and RF is not familiar to us, it has to become familiar to you, because everything can be seen on the transparent battlefield, and all three of these can be seen by the machines. Strike, long-range killing power. Long-range killing power is nothing new to us. That's something we've had for a very long time. But the weak link in the chain was the ability to detect the target you want to kill in the first place. If you have no idea where the target is, you can't strike it. Now, as we've just said earlier, the transparent battlefield, the probability of being detected is almost 100%. Therefore, it's likely you will be detected and you can be hit. Our opponents, such as Russia, has weapons that can reach as far as the UK. So your range from the front line is irrelevant. Chances are you've been detected, and chances are you can be hit. That's what's happened here. This here is a small unit trying to use sneaky tactics in a large area of operation. They thought they were getting away with it, but they were detected and they were struck by long-range fires. Back in the old days, they might have got away with this. In the new ways of war, the transparent battlefield linked to long-range fires, they didn't get away with it. The Royal United Services Institute, RUSI, at the start of the 2022 Russian invasion of Ukraine, did a study. When the Russians were using more like traditional artillery kill chains with a forward observer with a radio, there was a delay between detection of the target to first artillery rounds in the air. So when they were using just a forward observer with a radio, that delay was approximately 20 to 40 minutes. That's now changed. With UAVs, the artillery crew had a live feed to a system to where their shots were landing and could correct in real time. So now the delay between detection of a target to first artillery rounds in the air is now more like 2 to 4 minutes. That is fast. Now, these types of systems, these artillery systems and long-range fires, they pack a hell of a punch. So that's still going to be required for hardened targets and when you need to deliver a lot of damage. So these sorts of systems are not going anywhere. But the problem is they are a prestige level capital asset. They have long lead times to make new ones, and they're difficult and expensive to replace and repair, and they are in relatively short supply. In Russian doctrine, they are artillery centric, so they are very heavy on the use of artillery. So at their height, they were using about 100,000 shells per day in Ukraine. They're now starting to find that the barrels for their systems are starting to degrade and need replacing, and they're struggling. So the rate of artillery fire is definitely slowing. But also, on the transparent battlefield, when these things pull the trigger, there's a high risk that they are detected when they fire. So the probability of being detected and receiving counter fire is very high. So if you have good protective umbrellas, when the enemy takes a shot, they reveal themselves. So it could be that when they take the shot, The cost is they have to know they're sacrificing the gun and the crew to take that shot to kill the target that they're aiming at. And that there is a key component on how to survive on the modern battlefield. You have to make yourself economically unviable to be killed. So they can see you and they can hit you, but they don't know what you are, they don't know why you're there, they've no idea if you're worth killing, you're too small. You are trying to put a cost versus benefit analysis onto the enemy, where even though they can see you and they can kill you, you're so worthless, it's not worth the cost of taking the shot. So it's a battle of the survival of the worthless. Now, with these types of systems, there's a critically important weakness you need to be aware of, and that's that they are actually not particularly great against moving targets, because when you pull the trigger, there is a delay, and depending on how far away the target is, that could be as much as a minute. So if it's a moving target and it changes direction or speed, you miss. So that gap needs to be filled, and that's where these types of systems comes into play. We are now about to make one of the most critical points of this entire briefing. These bits of machinery are important because of their acrobatic performance in chasing down and killing moving targets. That's what's caused so much paralysis on Ukraine's front line. If you break cover, you get spotted, you get chased, and you get killed, because these can chase down the moving targets. These attack systems' primary effect on the battlefield that they've had is in a counter mobility and fixing of forces. It's too dangerous to move. They're abundant, they're completely expendable with short lead times. They're cheap enough to warrant using multiples of them to kill a single soldier, but powerful enough to decimate prestige level armoured vehicles. And they are having a very important psychological effect on the battlefield, because they are capable of some very complex attack runs. So this next one I find particularly harrowing. Let me introduce you to the FPV ambush. The Ukrainian battlefield has now been filled with these unmanned systems like this. It's become an unmanned hellscape, causing military forces to be stuck in position. The weak point of these systems, though, is that in a lot of cases they lack some of the punch of those large artillery systems. So if you combine those two types of things together, you get a really viciously effective effect on the battlefield, where you deploy your unmanned hellscape to force the enemy to take cover because it's too dangerous to move. So they're stuck in position, you countered their mobility, and they are fixed. And then with your heavy systems, you just start smashing them, because now they're a static target. So what you're seeing here is a FPV kamikaze drone. With these unmanned systems, one of the known critical weak points is the data link between the pilot and the system. What you're seeing on the underside of it is not a bomb. That is a drum containing a fibre optic wire somewhere between 10 to 40 kilometres long. What that effectively does, it makes this drone unjammable. So any electronic warfare protection measures people are using on the ground have become useless against this type of system. The only course of action available to you with this type of threat on the battlefield is to either get into physical protection so it can't get to you, or to destroy it in the air. They have become wildly successful, and the casualty rate has skyrocketed because of these, and they are now everywhere. What you're seeing there, all that glistening, is fibre optic wire. That is from a whole squadron of FPV drones being flown in this area for days, if not weeks, if not months on end. And as a second example, I'm going to show you the same thing again, but in an urban area. This is a very mainstream thing that's being seen out on the battlefield in Ukraine at the moment. It was originally brought in as an urgent operational requirement to deal with the effect of electronic warfare jamming on the use of unmanned systems. So there is work being done out there to come up with a better method of overcoming the jamming problem, but this, in the meantime, does the job. This is representative of how that jamming and counter-jamming electronic warfare battle has become a centre of gravity in the modern arms race. We are no longer talking, though, just about unmanned aerial vehicles. The UAVs have proved to be very effective, simple bits of kit capable of decimating prestige level systems, and it's caused a desire to repeat the effect on land and sea as well. This is especially true for unmanned ground vehicles, because, to put none too fine a point on it, soldiers are in short supply and the front line is enormous, and land-based operations are getting so impossibly dangerous. So unmanned ground vehicles are very much ramping up hard. Now, these are relatively simple technologies to develop and build and make in large numbers. So what you'll find happening is new types of systems are very easy to develop and field very quickly. So what you'll see happening is machines appearing on the battlefield that you've never seen before, and you've no idea what they can do. So it's very literally a zero-day threat that can kill you. And because they're being developed and changed so fast, that zero-day threat can come about pretty much again and again and again every 3 to 6 months. So let me give you an example. See if you can work out what's going on here. Did you see that? That is a grenade launching drone. So you've seen FPV drones, you've seen grenade dropping drones, but did you know there are already grenade launching drones out there? If you're one of those soldiers getting into cover thinking you're protecting yourself and this thing punts a grenade straight at you, you are not going to learn that lesson. It's a zero-day threat that can kill you. So now where this starts to get particularly spicy, again because they're simple and easy to field, is when you have a combined system. So I don't mean systems working cooperatively like an ISR system and a strike system. I mean a system that's got multiple capabilities blended into a single system. For example, the bottom left, that Sea Baby, there is a version of that out there that opens up a hatch on the top and a small squadron of FPV UAVs can pop out and attack its targets, and then the boat can also drive into its target. So what it does is it adds more viable combinations to what these systems might be able to do. So you end up being limited only by your imagination. So it makes it even harder to preempt what that new threat on the battlefield is and how you should respond. And for a truly dystopian nightmare, try this one.
Here's Curtain Company, a unit with Ukraine's 28th Brigade using a robot dog to help them scout out an urban environment. The soldiers are able to stick to cover up against the side of buildings or underneath trees, while the dog is sent out into the open spaces between the buildings where the soldiers might get shot to scout out enemy positions. Photos from the same training exercise show it was also being taught how to scout out buildings alongside the troops. And this video shows a terrifying vision of what war might look like if the dogs are trained to attack rather than defend. Someone has fitted a flamethrower to the back of the dog, where the robotic arm mount usually goes, turning the machine into a potentially lethal killer.
75% of Russian casualties are now from drone strike, even though 75% of Ukrainian drones never reach the target. That statistic is wild. Once identified, you have 2 to 4 minutes to live. It's a battle of survival of the worthless, using sacrificial military forces, and now the two big main points: counter mobility and fixing effect, and small units gaining overpowered ISR and killing capability beyond anything they've ever seen. That last one, bear that in mind, because that is coming back with a vengeance. Now let's move on to the threat. What you're seeing here is a random selection of Pacific islands. Now bear with me on this, right? If you cast your mind back to World War II and War in the Pacific, where it was this island hopping warfare, where we had our islands and they had theirs. All of these islands are unsinkable fortresses where there's radar, there's long-range fires, observation posts, communication stations. They're all able to network together. But basically, because these islands had a long-range reach, it made the open waters around the islands impassable. The Navy could not operate in those areas because they were just no-go zones. They would just get seen, struck and destroyed. So for these islands, the island hopping warfare revolved around the idea of these islands being able to reach into and strike in the open areas. What that meant is, at some point, if I want this war to progress, I need to move from my island onto your island and dig you out and take you from it. So ultimately, the only types of operations that could happen in this area were amphibious operations, where I launch from my island, cross the waters onto your island and dig you out. But I could not carry out operations on the open waters. I could only cross the waters. So why was that relevant? Well, ever since the Cold War, we in NATO have known that if/when Russia ever chooses to invade NATO territory, the way they would do it is they would amass an enormous mechanized and armored military, and they would move fast and hard through all the open terrain, as deep into NATO territory as fast as they could, to cause as much chaos as they could. But what they would do is they would bypass and isolate all of the areas of complex terrain, and they would leave those for follow-on forces to deal with them. We in NATO, ever since the Cold War, have known the way we would respond is to arm the crap out of these islands of complex terrain. And what we would do is we would turn those open areas into kill zones, basically bogging down that huge military and put them in a position where they cannot do their plan. they'll have no choice other than to stop what they're doing and dig us out of these complex terrains before they can move forward. We're putting them in a position where they have no choice but to deal with that and stop with their original plan. So effectively, what you're now seeing in modern warfare is a more pronounced and literal version of this island hopping warfare happening on land, where it's islands of complex terrains, whether it's urban, dense woodlands, caves, subterranean trenches, mountains, whatever. But it's islands of complex terrain surrounded by the shark-infested waters of the open terrain. The unmanned Hellscape, with its counter-mobility effect, has denied the use of the open waters around these islands. So now, operations in those open waters is going to get you killed. So we're now seeing an island hopping war. We have our islands and they have theirs, and every offensive is effectively an amphibious operation where it starts in complex terrain and it ends in complex terrain, but you only cross the open waters. What you can't do is operate in those open waters. You can't just stop and set up headquarters and command posts or try to do resupplies in those open waters. You're going to get annihilated. However, amphibious operations are notoriously dangerous, especially now with the use of unmanned systems. To demonstrate this, let me introduce you to something known as the Avdiivka defense.
Say we have a Ukrainian defensive position here, a typical trench dug into a tree line to provide some cover. And here's a Russian armoured column coming to attack it. If the Ukrainians have had time, they will have laid a first line of defences somewhere out in the fields they're guarding. A line of landmines, perhaps also some barbed wire and tank traps. In order to get at the Ukrainians, the Russians will first have to navigate this. If they're lucky, they'll have a tank with a mine plough leading the column that can clear a gap. Otherwise, they'll just have to hope they can steer between the explosives, maybe losing a couple of vehicles along the way. Behind that line of defences will be artillery and anti-tank weapons pre-sighted on routes of attack, ready to open fire the second the Russians drive into them. In the early days of the war, this would have been Ukraine's main line of defense, but both anti-tank missiles and artillery shells are now in very short supply. The main line of defense is now here, a drone zone that is within range of FPVs which will hunt down any vehicles which survive these defenses. For the FPVs to work, surveillance drones have to be in the skies spotting the Russian columns advancing. Orders are then relayed to a drone unit which deploys behind the front line and launches their drones. Guided by the surveillance drones, these FPVs then spread out and hunt down any remaining Russian tanks or armoured vehicles to blow up.
In cities such as Avdiivka and places like Vuhledar, the Ukrainians were using that form of defence and the Russians were still trying to attack them with these massed attacks, and the result was enormous casualties on the Russian side. In Vuhledar, the Russians were losing whole brigades at a time trying to take that city. If China was smart, bear with me again on this, if they were smart, they would be building millions of unmanned maritime surface and subsurface vehicles combined with missiles and UAVs and air defence systems. And they would send those into the Pacific Ocean en masse, so that when they launch their attack on Taiwan, the US Navy's reaction force cannot get there to interfere and tip the balance in favour of Taiwan. Effectively, the same has happened on land. Those open areas of the Great Plains are now the unpassable oceans. So for us in the UK, training in places like Kenya, Salisbury Plain, Brecon Beacons are irrelevant because those open areas are now just big no-go zones filled with sharks. So for modern NATO militaries, they cannot operate in those large areas. Something has to change. So therefore, here are our biggest threats. Movement on the battlefield is now one of the most dangerous things you can do. Infiltration, exfiltration, redeploy, relief in place of troops, resupply runs, deploying a quick reaction force, even deploying Kazovac runs. These have become wildly dangerous. For casualties over in Ukraine at the moment, it's not uncommon for a casualty to have to wait as much as 6 days before being rescued. The biggest impact of the unmanned systems is the unmanned systems Hellscape with the counter mobility and fixing effect, which means effectively combined arms maneuver warfare as we know it has been neutralized. Maneuver warfare is becoming unviable because of the casualty rate, i.e. the method of warfare that we in NATO have been training for over 100 years has stopped working. Both sides are having to revert to a fires or drones first approach based on heavily fortified positions. The US Army and NATO are already redesigning their doctrine to account for this. But the main problem is it results in a stalemate where both sides are stuck on their island. So eventually someone has to carry out this amphibious attack, which, as we've just identified, is wildly dangerous. So the question becomes, how is it going to be done? Russia has sort of given us the answer. They have become notorious for what's being referred to as the meat assault, where they just get a whole load of soldiers they don't care about and just throw numbers at the problem. It's a saturation attack where what they're trying to do is give the Ukrainians so many targets that they just can't kill them fast enough to overwhelm them by sheer bloody number. Well, we're going to do the same, but instead of soldiers we don't care about, we'll throw machines we don't care about at the problem. So what you have is the coming age of combined arms swarm warfare and the unmanned hellscape, an endless, relentless torrent of machines that we don't care about, as fast as your supply chain can churn out and overwhelm the enemy by sheer bloody number.
Shields up, red alert! Fire at will!
Sir, our phasers are having minimal effect and our torpedoes can't track their movements.
Fire everything we've got.
Captain, we are not equipped for this manner of engagement.
Shield frequencies have no effect, sir.
They took out the dish. Shields are inoperable.
So the early warning signs that this was coming happened back in winter 2024, which is about a year ago from where I am today.
In December, Ukraine's unmanned army struck like a ghost. FPV drones screaming through the air, gun-toting ground bots rolling in. The first pure unmanned ground robotic assault in history. The Battle of Lipsy, a coordinated strike where machines on land and in the air work together to tear into enemy lines. No Ukrainian boots on the ground.
So what you just saw was a proof of concept attack. But since then, on the 14th of July 2025, Ukraine's 3rd Brigade employed the exact same method on an operation, a live operation. So that was proof that this idea is becoming now adopted on the ground. Bearing in mind, I also said to you, there's that statistic where approximately 75% of Russian casualties are now from drone strike, even though approximately 75% of Ukrainian drones don't reach the target. So it's already here. But where I am now, at the end of 2025, this is now becoming the primary method of warfare, where these unmanned systems are the frontline forces in the most danger, taking the biggest hits, delivering the most damage. Even manned forces are starting to break down into swarms, and you're seeing this on the Russian side, where what they started doing is, instead of getting an armoured vehicle and packing it full of soldiers to deliver onto the front line, instead they're breaking it down into a swarm of soldiers on individual motorbikes and just gun it across the open terrain and get onto the Ukrainian positions as fast as they can. And it's proving highly effective, but it is a huge risk, because if the Ukrainian drone swarm is active, they will get massacred. But the same is true if they were doing it in the original way in an armoured vehicle. That's still a huge gamble. So even unmanned forces are breaking down now into these swarm tactics. So the problem with these unmanned system swarms is you are constrained to how big that swarm can be by the number of human operators you can get access to control them, which is why artificial intelligence is now becoming such a big deal. On the left, you're seeing the NVIDIA Jetson Orin, and on the right, you're seeing the Auterion Skynode. Without going too deeply, what you're seeing here is two viable methods for an effectively commercial off-the-shelf solution for putting artificial intelligence into drones. What these do is they break that constraint for the size of your swarm. It's because now every drone that comes off the production line can be made into a trained, combat-hardened veteran with thousands of combat missions to their name. And it means you can pump these out thousands per day at whatever rate your production line can supply, far faster than you could ever train human soldiers.
A few thousand kilometers from the front line, this is where everything starts.
Every 23 seconds in this facility, we have already one drone.
350 3D printers. Today, they can produce 4,000 per day. But the point is that it means that they can produce millions per year.
So what then actually happens is a single human operator now no longer controls a single system, but now that single human operator acts as a commander for an entire squadron. The question I now have for you is what happens when a swarm attack collides with a swarm defence? Well, one of our sergeants is a reservist and works in their civilian role within counter UAS systems. They went on this exercise where it was a drone versus counter drone exercise, and their team were the top scorers, but they still lost. So all that actually means is they were the ones who held out the longest before getting defeated. The conclusion they came to is it was physically beyond human capability to be able to think and act fast enough. So now, let me introduce you to Project Asgard. If what we were just discussing was the AI soldiers in the swarm, this, Asgard, is the AI field marshal of the swarm. If we were in the Terminator movie, this is Skynet. It's an AI-powered, strategic-level military targeting and battle management system. With AI onboard drones, it's constrained by the weight of the equipment and processing power you can put on board. So it's good enough so that at the tactical level, the drones can coordinate the swarm and chase and kill the targets. But for this, because it's ground-based, they can take advantage of the processing power of ground-based data centers. So it allows them to tap into those really top-tier capabilities of AI. So if your AI soldiers are connected to this, all of the sensors, the drones, the attack systems connected to this, you end up with a swarm warfare military that can detect, understand, assess, predict, attack and counterattack at machine speed, far faster than any human-centric system could ever achieve. In fact, you end up at a point where the human thought process becomes a detriment to the system. So when you end up in a war of swarm versus swarm, state versus state, humans are just too slow. We cannot handle that much noise that fast. So things such as Project Asgard are now inevitable. Okay, that was a lot of information. So here's what I'd now like to suggest. Take a break. Go take 20 minutes, have a drink, digest what we've discussed so far, and then come back. But I'd like you to try and take the opportunity to use your own creative and imaginative thought process with the information we've just learned to see if you can come up with your own ideas and preempt of what I might be about to say in the next section. See you shortly. Alright, welcome back. Now let's look at the response. Everything we've discussed so far is about giving you the contextual background to understand this section. So let's get into it. Lethality and survivability are the two main things we're going to look at. You can't have one without the other. So for example, with the lethality, it doesn't matter how lethal you are if you're too easy to kill before you ever get the chance to show how lethal you're going to be. Lethality and survivability are hand in hand and are the two things that we're about to discuss. Lethality and the hunter-killer concept. As we discussed earlier, Recce and Strike is now the main kill chain being used. The hunter-killer concept is the tactic to utilize that kill chain on the ground. So we're going to talk in terms of an infantry platoon, right? To demonstrate the idea. An integrated platoon is broken down and utilized in a new way. The platoon breaks apart into hunter-killer teams. Each hunter-killer team is given an area of operations, a general direction, appropriate control measures from the commander such as boundaries, limit of exploitation, actions on, that kind of thing, and they're set loose to go free hunting. The platoon commander's role changes from less of a direct control and more into the owner of the platoon's main firepower. Effectively, the platoon is breaking down into smaller packets and sent out to free hunt for the enemy. So you're going to have smaller formations gaining overpowered ISR and killing capability. See, I told you that idea was going to come back. For it to work, each hunter-killer team must have its own organic small ISR system, and it must have some form of primary killing power. So whether that's FPV attack drones, whether it's a heavy machine gun, anti-tank capability, sharpshooter, air defense, whatever, it must have its own small ISR capability and its own primary killing power. So let's dig into it. So here is the simplest version. So here's our hunter-killer platoon broken apart and going out free hunting. And one of our hunter-killer teams pushes out their ISR and they find a small packet of enemy forces that they conclude they can deal with themselves. Obviously this depends on the rules of engagement from the platoon commander, but they go ahead and use their primary killing power and just destroy the enemy. So now let's look at another scenario. So this time our hunter-killer team pushes out their ISR and they find an enemy force that this time is a little bit too big for them to deal with by themselves. There is a version of this where the platoon commander will orchestrate the wolf pack, but the main point of the hunter-killer team will be that the platoon commander then pushes out their own ISR to get a live video feed, and they have the larger killing power and they'll just deal with it for them and remove the enemy from the equation. So in this next scenario is where things get really spicy. So there is our team, they push out their ISR, and this time they find an enemy force that's massive. It's well beyond anything the entire platoon can handle. This is where the platoon commander earns their pips and becomes that real owner of large killing power. They will be using their system operator to communicate to a higher level formation such as a company, battalion or brigade and utilise their firepower and send in a swarm of drones and long range fires to obliterate this enemy formation. So this platoon is using outrageous killing power to attack this large enemy force. Once that enemy force has the back of their defence has been broken, only then do what we would consider conventional heavy or manned forces go in to deliver that final hammer blow and force the roll up of that front line and force the enemy into a retreat. So in other words, in this hunter-killer concept, the hunter-killer teams are predominantly the hunters, and now the platoon commander's role is to be predominantly the killer. Small formations gaining overpowered ISR and killing capability beyond anything they've ever experienced. The phrase I'm hearing coming out of the US Army at the moment is painfully light and disproportionately lethal. But an important point to take away from this is this: the machines are up front as the main force, taking the greatest risk and delivering the main damage. They are up front to protect the soldiers who are now further away from the danger. Now bear in mind something we discussed earlier, which was the Avdiivka defence. I'd like you to now change your terminology and recognise the Avdiivka defence is effectively the hunter-killer concept, utilising the Requiem strike in a defensive posture. So bearing that in mind, let's have a look at what happens when an old ways integrated attack collides with a new ways hunter-killer defence. So the video you're about to see is from early in the 2022 Russian invasion, and it is an integrated Russian platoon attacking a Ukrainian position using a hunter-killer defence. If you have military experience, the video you're about to watch should feel disturbingly familiar, because it to me looks like us. It looks like a 2-up platoon attack, advanced to contact on an enemy position on Salisbury Plain.
Тут такой замес, блядь, нас, сука, кидают в бой, блядь, мы мясом берем, блядь. Украинская артиллерия есть, хрен что будет за По одиночным целям даже хернячим.
И арбалеты, ща Вагнера подъедут. Где-то, где звон монеты, танцуют, их там нет. И лето, и арбалеты, ща Вагнера подъедут. Где-то, где звон монеты, танцуют, их там нет. Я был на дискотеке в Триполи, полет валькирий. Я танцевал в Бенгази, Донбассе, Пальмире.
So what I've just shown you there, for the shock value to get through to you, is the effect it has on infantry. There is plenty of videos out there showing this exact same thing happening to armoured formations. Now we're going to look at survivability. We've all heard that the best form of defence is a good offence. Totally agree, completely true. What's the next question you should be asking yourself? The question is, so what makes the best form of offence? The answer is one launched from a well-defended position. Being lethal is irrelevant if you are killed before you get to show how lethal you are. Lethality and survivability go hand in hand. So within survivability, we're going to look at two elements: hard to find and hard to kill. Hard to find. What you're seeing here is the UK 1 Division deployable headquarters, and that is comically unacceptable. A target like this is easy to find and easy to destroy. It's a high gain target with a low cost to destroy. In that cost versus benefit analysis for the enemy, this is a bargain target. Russian systems such as Kinzhal and Iskander missiles, they were made for targets like this, even though they're expensive and in short supply. But now the Russians don't even have to waste those systems on a target like this, because there are much more abundant and affordable systems to do this. So things like the Shahed fixed-wing kamikaze drone, depending on the variant, have a range of anywhere from 1,000 to 2,500 kilometers. All you need to do is send a fleet of them at this, and it will just wipe out this target, keeping those Kinzhal and Iskander missiles for something even more valuable. Something like this, it will be found, it will be hit, and everyone will die. If you really need a location this concentrated together, it must be deep underground, but this is utterly unacceptable. So what are you supposed to do? Well, here we have our large headquarters again. Now remember, we are in a battle of survival of the worthless, so you need to mess with the cost versus benefit analysis in the enemy's head. So with our headquarters, what we're going to do from now on is break it apart into smaller packets that are worth less and disperse them into different locations. Now the problem is, each one of these individual packets is still a single critical point of failure in the system. So you need to add some redundancy into this system to build some resilience. So you need another headquarters, an alternate headquarters, which again you break apart into smaller packets and disperse into different locations. So now we've got some resilience in the system. So we're now messing with the enemy's cost versus benefit analysis, because each individual packet is worth less, and the amount of gain they get for destroying one of these targets has also reduced. Now we're going to mess with that cost versus benefit analysis even further with a third headquarters, a false one, a headquarters of lies, which again we break into smaller parts and disperse into different locations. So now we're talking about fake command posts, fake transmissions, fake frequencies, fake activity. So now when the enemy takes the shot, they're not even sure if they're getting any gain from this at all. Now if you look at that, that to me looks like a swarm headquarters. So this is where there's a very unusual silver lining to the cloud that was COVID-19. Because of COVID-19, we've now learned how to work and collaborate together remotely like this. So for the staff who are working in these locations, you're going to have to get used to doing that again. So if you remember earlier, we discussed how movement on the ground is one of the most dangerous things you can do. So that's going to involve logistics. So to reduce the logistics movement need, each of these packets is going to have to be as self-sustaining as reasonably possible to reduce the logistics burden. But that can only last so long. So eventually there will be the logistics need, and that will again be swarm logistics, where the cargo is broken apart into smaller packets, put onto smaller units and unmanned systems, and dispersing them like a swarm, with hoping that enough of it gets through. With the communications between all of these packets, it's going to be very much like a swarm communications. So you're in a position where you're talking about swarm attacks, swarm defences, swarm headquarters, swarm logistics, and swarm communications. So although I'm talking about a large headquarters, the same principle can be applied to any large military force. It just needs to be broken apart into smaller packets and dispersed into different locations. And as you'll notice, it's still within those complex islands, not out in the shark-infested waters. You also need to make sure that every single one of these packets are expendable and replaceable. If you have any capital asset that is too valuable to lose, it's only a matter of time before it gets destroyed. So everything must be expendable and replaceable in order for this to work. Right, what you're seeing here is from an exercise I went on a little while ago. So this is a little command post that we set up. So what you can see is that's our command post there. So outside is our vehicle, which is camouflaged, and the command post is inside the building, which is concealed. Camouflage and concealment. And this is a closer view. So the one on the top left, that's a close-up from the previous picture you just saw. The one in the bottom right, that's from a different exercise, literally one exercise later. So you can see how quickly we improved from one exercise to the other. Now, I'm not just showing you this just to show off. There is a reason I'm showing you this, right? So here's what I'd like you to consider. What I'd like you to consider is that from now on, stuff like this is obviously comically unacceptable. They're easy to find, obviously valuable, and easy to kill. They are bargain targets for the enemy. If, again, you have any military experience, these two images should feel disturbingly familiar to you. The one on the right, that's from an exercise in Kenya. So when they went exercise, they were told the OPFOR were going to have drones, and then they're put into this exercise in Kenya, which is legendary for its thousands of miles of open terrain. These guys were dropped into the middle of shark-infested waters, and they were set up to fail from the word go. They were never going to succeed. These are comically unacceptable and disturbingly familiar. It has to stop. So we're now going to revisit the EO, IR and RF light. Now, I dug into a little bit of camouflage and concealment before this slide because I wanted to put the idea front and centre of your mind before we came on to this, okay? So if you consider camouflage and concealment, what they actually mean. So camouflage is the disruption of the light so the enemy doesn't recognise what they're seeing, whereas concealment is detection avoidance by blocking the light from reaching the enemy in the first place. Well, for us, we understand and recognise this in the world of electro-optical. At the moment, every single soldier is required to be good at this. So the reason I bring this up is to help you understand that actually IR and RF signature management is actually not as complex as you think it is. It's still just camouflage and concealment, but just in a different waveform of light. So the problem is in IR, there are thermal cameras everywhere now. Because the technology has evolved and it's been miniaturized and more cost effective, infrared detection is a genuinely real problem on the battlefield now. But when it comes to camouflage and concealment, the problem is there is no mainstream viable option for infrared camouflage. That is a currently known critical capability gap. The only option in the IR spectrum is concealment, i.e. hiding, making sure your IR light doesn't reach the enemy sensors to begin with. Every single soldier should be expected to be good at this, but for some reason at the moment we're just not. So with the RF light there is a similar problem now because the equipment to detect RF frequencies again is evolved, miniaturized, and it's more commercially available. It's become very easy to fill an area of operations with static RF sensor networks, or very easy to integrate them into unmanned systems. So it's getting to a point that when you broadcast your RF frequencies, it's becoming very easy to detect, triangulate and strike and kill the target. But again, it's still camouflage and concealment, but in a slightly different way. So with camouflage, you're talking about deception and noise. So creating fake stations, broadcasting fake transmissions. You're talking about using frequencies that already exist locally. I've even heard of some Ukrainian commanders setting up Xboxes or PlayStations in their headquarters, logging onto something like Call of Duty and using the in-game chat function as a way of camouflaging their communications. With concealment, it's slightly different. It's still making sure the RF light doesn't reach the enemy, but you're talking about turning down the power. You're talking about using the terrain to do your screening, use of hard lines and fiber lines and directional antenna. It's still basically making sure the RF light doesn't reach the enemy to begin with. It's still camouflage and concealment. So it means that we as soldiers in the modern era, we need to be good at this, this and this. But for some reason we're just not, and we're not actually challenging ourselves to get good at this. Although there's nothing new here, we seem to treat it like it's some kind of strange niche knowledge for a particular group of specialists and they deal with it. No. This is now core competency for the profession of being a soldier, and we've all got to get good at this. So let's do a quick example just to show you what I mean, right? So here are some of those packets, those headcores that have been broken apart. The one in the middle is trying to communicate out to the other packets. What we found recently on exercise here in the UK is we were using an omnidirectional antenna here in the UK, and we were able to speak to people in Germany, which means the RF frequency goes a lot further than you expect it to. So there's your enemy drones out there looking for your RF signals, and your frequency goes further than you expect it to. Easy to triangulate, easy to locate, easy to destroy. So now let's try again. So this time you've got two packets that are trying to reach out to each other, but what they've done is they've turned the power right down to avoid the RF light going too far. So what's happening is in this case they're relaying it through all the other packets. Of course, this can just be done with hard lines and fiber optic lines and directional antenna, skyways and commercial radios and that kind of thing as well. But also what they're going to do is they're going to use the terrain in their advantage to screen it, just to block it from reaching the enemy in the first place. So there you go. Straight away we have an example of concealment in the RF spectrum. At this point, I'd like to now draw your attention to a really important lie that we in the NATO militaries have convinced ourselves of. And it's that the idea that there is a clear delineation between not in combat and in combat, which most of us would recognise with the phrase contact front. So we seem to have this idea that contact front is a delineation between not in combat and in combat. It's a lie. By the time you have contact front, you've been in combat with the enemy for hours, as you've just seen with the principles we've just been discussing. If the first point you realise I'm in combat is when those rounds come at you, you're already losing, because the enemy has been in combat with you for hours and they are literally 10 steps ahead of you. Combat is much fuzzier around the edges than we have convinced ourselves. We have lied to ourselves. Hard to kill. So what you have here is two groups of soldiers out on a patrol in the open waters. Whatever this lot are doing, they're already dead. They're in the shark-infested waters like it's no big deal. They're going to be seen, they're going to be attacked, and they'll have nowhere to go. This mentality is a relic from operations where we could get away with this kind of thing, including those counter-terrorism operations. So again, I'm showing it happen to infantry for shock value to get through to you, but there's plenty of video out there of the exact same thing happening to armoured patrols. For some reason, we know this stuff doesn't work anymore, but when we go on exercise, we still keep practicing for doing these patrols in these open areas. It has to stop. It's not going to work anymore. This needs to be your fieldcraft from now on. I'd like you to imagine that what you're looking at are examples of the small packets of a larger force out deployed in the field. In this island hopping war, we need to be able to operate, fight and move through this type of terrain. We need to reject the idea of these people training and practicing to fight in open terrain. It's a lie. It requires completely different skill sets and completely different tactics, which we need to retrain ourselves for and make those our primary understanding for the soldiering profession. It also means for our training areas, we need to rethink it. So places like Salisbury Plain, Brecon Beacons, Carwent, Kenya, those kind of training grounds are no longer helping us. There is also a common thread with these environments you need to be aware of. Because everyone is reverting to a fires or drone first warfare, not a manoeuvre warfare, military positions are very commonly being now dug underground. Command posts, intelligence cells, drone control locations, medical triage, comm stations, you name it. Going underground has become critical to survival, which means subterranean warfare is a very common thread that we're going to have to get really good at.
The future of warfare isn't just above us with the use of drones, satellite imagery, and probably Google Street View. It's also below us in the dark, damp, technologically devoid depths. With UAVs armed with Hellfires and DJI Mavics dropping grenades, they've introduced new horrors and caused us all to look up. It's the fight below our feet that many in the US military are planning for. The origins of subterranean warfare trace back nearly 4,000 years to the Assyrians, and it's persisted ever since. As fighting around the world goes underground, from the tunnels under Gaza to the gas pipes and trenches in Ukraine, and cover from cheap drones and advanced ISR capabilities become a priority, sending Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea deeper into the tunnel systems, the US military is preparing troops to fight below the surface. But training isn't the only thing on the minds of military planners. They're also exploring technologies for things that don't work underground, like GPS and, as a result, drone autonomy and navigation capabilities, radios, and even night vision without ambient light to magnify. Based on experiences in Ukraine, Iraq, Syria, and elsewhere, they're building and training the tech right now as we speak. As the great Aldo Raine said right before a fictional rendezvous in a pub, or basement, I guess, in the movie Inglourious Basterds set during World War II.
You know, fighting in a basement offers a lot of difficulties. Number one being, you're fighting in a basement.
But what that really looks like is elaborate tunnels, some of which you can barely fit through as a big American service member, deep underground where there's only one way in and one way out.
In this island hopping war, if the enemy amphibious attack has succeeded and they've gotten past your hunter-killer defences onto your island, it will get grisly close. In 2025, the nature of the front line changed again, because the front line is big and soldiers are in short supply, which means the front line is very lightly manned, and it gave rise to something known as infiltrator units. So what happens is a force is broken down into a lot of small 4 or 5 man groups who are then pushed out to try and find holes in the front line. So the ones that do find a hole, well, the ones that don't, they just get killed. But the ones that do, they'll find a hole through and find a location in depth and radio through, and other units will then follow through the same path to link up with them and gather mass and then launch an attack in the rear. So what's happening is it's becoming quite common for forces in depth, especially non-combat forces, to find themselves coming face to face with Russian infantry and having to fight them themselves. It will no longer be acceptable for any soldier, even non-combat ones, to be ill-equipped or incompetent at having a fight. which means even non-combat forces are going to need to have teeth and claws. 4 magazines and 1 grenade each is no longer going to cut it. It's going to be completely unacceptable for any of us to be incompetent or ill-equipped to have a fight. We're going to need these more aggressive, more exotic weapon systems, more prolific amongst more forces. If the enemy gets onto our island, we need to be able to make them to regret it, because there's likely no quick reaction force coming to help us, so we need to be a hard target. But important point to remember is this would still be the second line of defence. Our primary line of defence, our primary teeth and claws for our packet, is still going to be unmanned systems forces. So I know we've looked at the hunter-killer defence, but let's actually run through it for our little packet, right? So there's us in our little packet. We have some system out front as a screen and a recce, and some combat forces, again all unmanned systems, and the enemy comes along, gets detected. The unmanned systems do the attack, we also join on in the attack, but it means that when we're ready, we can just make a run for it and just leave those unmanned systems behind and not worry about recovering them, because they're just machines and we can leave them to fight and die whilst we run away. Bearing in mind, that small packet doesn't necessarily have to be the ones running these unmanned systems. Because of data links, there's absolutely no reason why a completely different group of people in a completely different location couldn't be running that main combat power for you to keep you protected whilst you do your job, and you use your exotic small arms fire when it's required. There was an article from November 2025 where a autonomous AI powered ground drone was able to hold a position solo for a month and a half against Russian attacks. There was also stories from mid-2024 when a remotely controlled static gun turret did the same purpose defending a bridge. It caused the Russians weeks of delay, a lot of casualties, and it gave the Ukrainians time to retreat, refit, dig in and prepare for the next battle. On a recent exercise, we went out in the field as a small unit to operate one of these kind of small packets. And whilst we were running our location, 50% of us were working, 50% were resting out of time, because it was the only way we could sustain for any length of time the job that we were doing. But what it meant is we could only really sustain 1 sentry position. Even 2 was a real push. So we really felt that vulnerability because we had virtually no defence or reconnaissance at all. In Ukraine, although they do have specialist drone units, they now consider that every unit is a drone unit. Unmanned systems has taken over as the primary firepower above rifles and grenades and GPMGs and that kind of system. It's much more common now for Ukrainian infantry units to go out with their primary firepower being a day sack full of drones. Units not using them will simply not be able to operate on the battlefield. It is the same kind of equivalent as stubbornly trying to stick with bows and arrows in the era of gunpowder and firearms. Because the manoeuvre-first approach has also stopped working, as we described earlier, everyone is reverting to a fires or drone-first approach because of the counter-mobility effect. So the probability of being detected is very high, the probability of taking fire is very high, and the probability of escape is very low. That means being heavily fortified has become, above all else, the primary survival mechanism. Relying on high mobility as your primary survival mechanism is likely going to fail, so everyone is digging in. But, paradoxically, high mobility is still critically important because you're going to need to have crash-out plans. If it really comes to it and you need to get out of there, you'll have less than 2 to 4 minutes to get out of there. So you'll have to have the high mobility. Now, I've heard several occasions of people talking to me about notice to move periods as an excuse to not have to worry about this. I've heard people say, it's fine. In this state, we'll have 30 minutes notice to move, or we'll have 4 hours. So don't worry about it. Don't worry about it. Bollocks. If you have to get out of there in quick order, you'll have 2 to 4 minutes to get out of there, where you'll have to just pile into vehicles and gun it, which means you're going to have a plan for a very aggressive teardown of your location and make preemptive decisions about what you're going to leave behind, because you will have to leave a lot of your kit behind. You're going to need to be both primarily heavily fortified but also highly mobile for your crash out plan. So let's sum that up with Andy's rules of survivability. Survival of the worthless, stick to the complex terrain. You've got your hard to find rules and your hard to kill rules. So your hard to find is disassembled and dispersed, redundancy, deception, all of your cam and concealment in the IR and RF, lies, deceptions and noise. In your hard to kill, it's your self-sufficiency, your teeth and claws, you're heavily fortified and you're highly mobile, being underground, complex terrain, expendable equipment, crash out plans, etc, etc. My recommendation to you is to take a screenshot of this, because now that I understand this, I use this as one of my primary driving TTPs for when I'm out on exercise. So the problem is, although there's nothing new here, the problem is for so long we treat this like this is some kind of special niche knowledge for specialists in some other unit to deal with, and we forget that no, this is now central core competency to the profession of being a soldier, for the survivability. When you combine that with the new idea for the lethality, for the hunter-killer concept, it's a game changer, and I highly recommend you roll with it and see what happens. So that's pretty much everything I have for you for now. Hopefully I've given you some useful insights and a better understanding of the new reality, and with a bit of luck I've given you some inspiration to try some new ideas. So with that, I'll just finish with this final thought for you. Thanks for listening and take care.